Um, so this is the third of three talks entitled Hope in the Dharma. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on Tsongkhapa's philosophy of emptiness and how it relates to compassion, because that seemed to be a direction that people who were here last time wanted me to see me go more in, because that is actually my area of scholarly expertise, is Tsongkhapa's philosophy of emptiness. In the first part of the talk, I'll talk about some other things that will start by reviewing a little bit some of the things we said about hope before, and then we'll work into talking more about emptiness and its relationship to compassion. But I won't have enough time to go through some of those more difficult philosophical topics in full detail. And so I wanted to just say that I gave a talk last September in the Hopkins. My teacher was Jeffrey Hopkins, and Shrivasti Abbey and the Uma Institute co-sponsored a series of talks, all online, by scholars who'd been trained by Jeffrey Hopkins. And I gave mine on September 22nd, and it explained to some extent, it summarizes what I've figured out over these years about Tsongkhapa's philosophy. And I'm going to hit on those topics tonight, but I won't be able to go into as much depth as I did in this video. So I just posted the links, so you can look at that if you wanted to go into more detail. Okay, so open the Dharma, stage 3. So I made a little miniature table of contents for tonight. First, a quick review of some of the key points from the last 2 weeks. Second, what does Tsongkhapa, which is our tradition, the Gelugpa tradition, which becomes the FPMT tradition, consider to be the subtlest meaning of emptiness and or dependent arising, depending on whether you look at it as a presence or an absence. And then how does that emptiness, the subtle emptiness that Chandrakirti and Tsongkhapa teach, how does it relate to ethical commitments and values? And then how does it relate to the possibility of knowing or not knowing or uncertainty? Okay, and those, so those are I'm going to go through those. I don't know, I've got maybe 7 or 8 slides on each of those things. So in the review category, first, one of the things I started out with was to quote the Anguttara Nikaya, where the Buddha says there are 3 kinds of people in the world: the hopeful, the hopeless, and the one who's done away with hope, right? And if you don't gloss this and read the rest of the sutta and see how it's explained, it sounds like the one who's done away with hope would be the same as the hopeless one. But it's not the case, because in context, you see that hope in this case really refers to expectation, or what is it Suzuki Roshi or one of those Zen masters talked about a gaining mind, a grasping after a future expectation. And the message of this sutta is that ordinary hope, right? The hopeful person, the ordinary hope, is a path of cyclic existence. I mean, it could be a path of cyclic existence that leads to a good rebirth as a human in the future. It's not saying that it's bad, right? But it doesn't lead to liberation. What leads to liberation is letting go of attachment to future appearances, grasping after attachment to future appearances. And that's why some, and in this case, specifically Roshi Joan Halifax, said, before she started exploring the issue, before she started thinking about it, because not really very many people have spent a lot of time writing and thinking about this, that it just sort of felt to her like hope was a kind of un-Buddhist thing. And that's why. It's because if you look up hope in the dictionary, it's very strongly linked to this idea of anticipating specific kind and expecting specific kind of future appearances. And you know when you meditate on a wish to be free, to be liberated, the thing is to try to practice letting go of your grasping after future appearances in this lifetime. And then if you can do that, let go of grasping after future appearances in future lifetimes. So yeah, that comes from Siddhartha Gautama. I just put his.
Excuse me, Professor Newland, is it possible for you to enlarge the screen? We're only seeing half of it. There you, thank you.
What? Really?
Yes.
No,
now it's good.
But that's not actually the slideshow. Hold on. Well, I don't understand. Can you, now you only see half?
Now I see the whole thing, how change happens. Before it was cut off at change. And I was like, I only saw everything to the left of
I think you're looking at, we must be looking at different things. Hold on. What screen am I sharing? Let's see. Maybe you're looking at a different PowerPoint than the one I'm talking about.
Yeah, how change happens.
No, that's not, yeah, it's the wrong. Okay, let's try again. Yeah, that's not what I'm talking about. It's a different thing. Okay, we'll have to start over. Okay, now. All right, this is what I'm talking about. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yeah, so I guess I had a PowerPoint from one of the previous nights up there. So this is the slide I just went over. Then I showed this picture. I say about 2,500 years ago for the Buddha, because I don't think anybody really knows. The dates in Indian history are very speculative, say, yeah. And therefore, I think it's almost always more accurate to, or honest to say, to give a range or an approximation rather than specific dates. So the idea is realistic hope or wise hope can, unlike unrealistic pessimism or optimism, can motivate us to action. So this is my, interpretation or takeaway from the Anguttara Nikaya. They're hopeless pessimists and the expectant optimists. And then they're observant realists who pay attention and learn from observing how things are changing, right? The sutta uses the example of, social climbing or caste climbing, people trying to move up in social status. And some people thinking there's no way that that's ever going to happen, so it doesn't matter what I do. And other people think, well, if I do this, then surely I will definitely be moving up the ladder. And then using that and then there's other people who just, do the right thing and then pay attention to whether something changes or not. And then using that as an example, the Buddha compares that to practitioner, right? Who's doing the practice, who's not doing any practice because they don't think this is possibly going to do any good, or people who do the practice, but with a strong sense of expectation of grasping that, it better pay off pretty quickly, or I'm not going to keep doing it. And then people who do the practice with a sense of determination and commitment, patience, right? And pay attention to what's working and not working in their practice and make adjustments, but not grasping after some specific kind of attainment. So, sometimes, if you have extreme pessimism or despair, it definitely is enervating in terms of having the energy to take action. But sometimes optimism can also prevent people from taking action because they're just sort of counting on the fact that something good will turn up. And there's various reasons, personality or faith in divine providence or some kind of reasons that people think, oh, I don't really have to do anything. Things will work out. So the realistic position, I like this, example from Barbara Kingsolver. Maybe someone will still be alive in February. It's not, maybe everybody will freeze to death, right? Or maybe we'll still have plenty of food left in February, but we don't really know. So I'll put some potatoes in the root cellar just in case. So you take action, right? Without having a specific, fixed idea in mind about how the future is going to work out. So this view, is what I'm calling wise hope, not ordinary hope that's associated with expectation, but wise hope that doesn't have expectation. Instead, it's based on uncertainty, which I'm associating with impermanence, things constantly changing, openness, emptiness, that there isn't any fixed nature in things. There isn't any predetermined path that things are going to take. And it's very difficult for us to absolutely know what for sure is going on. And at the same time, on values. So in the space of openness and that emptiness and impermanence provide, where we are uncertain how things are going to come out, we have values and commitments that we hold on to and stick with, right, through thick and thin. Keep on keeping on, whether things are working out at a particular time or not. And I tried to show in my first talk how this is basically the same thing that Martin Luther King taught, right? That you have to, accept finite disappointment while holding on to an infinite hope. So his infinite hope is like this bodhicitta commitment, how I'm calling it. Yeah. So it's wisdom to know that we don't know the future. And even what we take as knowledge about the present might be wrong, right? Because that often turns out to be the case. But at the same time, so that's the uncertainty side, which I'm calling the wisdom side, right? And the other side is to know that our choices make a difference and they affect how things go for ourselves and for others. So yeah, in the first talk, I was quoting Rebecca Solnit, and she's saying, yeah, things are really bad with climate change and many other dimensions, which we're aware. They're really bad. And it's true, they could get much worse. But how much worse is, in part related to how we choose to act and what's left over at the end of unfolding devastation also is unclear and unknown yet. And it partly depends on the kinds of choices that we make. Okay, so that's my review of the basic approach, that wise hope is dharmic hope because it's based on the wisdom side, which is ultimate uncertainty, and the ethics, compassion's method side, which is, a firm commitment to values. So I talked last time, I talked before about, I used a few different examples of how people wove these together. And one is from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and the other is from Thich Nhat Hanh. So in brief, His Holiness's words are that the way the world is today, he sets it up, we're really one entity, or in reality, there is no actual separate individual interest. We have the mistaken view that we're separate from the rest of the world. And so the actions we take on that basis are realistic, right? People are confused about what makes them happy. They think it's money. And values, right, get lost in people's materialistic quest. So he says the way to safeguard our own future, right, is to develop a sense of concern for the well-being of others. and goes on to say that, you know, this wisdom is accessible in many different religious traditions. And that he, while a staunch Buddhist, takes kindness as his real religion. I've given I think I've done, you know, talks before at Shantideva about kindness, you know, starting from this quote, that everything's built around and headed toward kindness. And this is what His Holiness says: when you practice with a sense of dedication to the well-being of others, you yourself will feel fulfilled, because this is the purpose of our life. So I was, you know, thinking about this, reading some other books, rereading How to Practice, a book by the Dalai Lama, and some books on practice by, you know, Jeffrey, my teacher. And yeah, one of the things, you know, that occurred to me is that, like, why do we want to become Buddhas? Why, you know, if we have a bodhisattva aspiration, is it, you know, we want to have these magnificent ability to emanate in all directions and enjoy the bliss of Buddhahood? It's like, no, it's like really the bodhisattva's reason for wanting to be a Buddha is because the Buddha is simply defined as the best possible helper that there could possibly be. And, you know, you want to become a Buddha, the core motivation for becoming a Buddha is to become the best possible helper. If the Buddha weren't the best possible helper, you would look around and think, well, what is the best possible helper? And try to be that instead, right? So that's why I'm saying that, you know, like, for example, I had somebody who argued with me and said, you can't really say that Buddhism boils down to kindness as the thing, because what about emptiness and realizing just being kind isn't going to lead you to liberation? Well, it's true. Doing good actions don't lead to liberation, right? But you know, it's not just that in Mahayana practice, it's not just about me getting liberated from suffering. It's like, it's about becoming the best possible helper of all beings, right? And the reason you want to do that, right? The way when you associate the best possible helper with the goal of becoming a Buddha, then that's what leads to having a bodhicitta mindset. So I think that he's absolutely right. That it does, of course, emptiness is critical. If you're going to help other people and liberate yourself, you need to realize emptiness. And in the Gelugpa way, that means you first have to understand emptiness. But the ultimate point of it all is to become the best helper of other beings. Okay, so Thich Nhat Hanh comes at the same thing of saying, we're not so separate from each other as we think we are, but he has a different way of talking about it, which you're probably familiar with. He says there's a cloud in the piece of paper. When we look deeply, we see the paper. In the paper, there's also the sun and the clouds and everything, all the lumber mill and the logger and the wheat that fed the logger and the parents of the logger, right? And all these things are necessary to the existence of the paper. There's no paper without these things. And when we look deeply, we also see ourselves in the paper. We feel like we're separate from the paper when we're looking at it, but he's saying if you stop and think about it, you know, your mind is meeting my mind when we're both looking at the same piece of paper. So he says to be is always to interbe, just like paper. It's not like an option to be in and of yourself. It's like if you're going to exist, if anything is going to exist, it's necessarily interexistent with everything else. That's the way Thich Nhat Hanh talks about it. And right, so drawing out from that, you know, along the lines of what Thich Nhat Hanh is saying, but bringing in some other people, you know, the idea is that we're inevitably vast, right? Because when we know ourselves, we see our relatedness to everything that we ordinarily take as other. And the American poet Walt Whitman, you know, had this experience. He experienced things from this point of view, and when he wrote the poem Song of Myself, and you think, oh gosh, this guy's a narcissist. But then it turns out that the myself that he's singing includes us. I mean, literally, it includes the dirt and the grass and everybody he sees in the street, and includes us people here living in the future are all included in what he considers himself when he's in this poetic trance, I guess you could say, right? So, right, when we really pay close attention to who we are, yeah, they're different beings, but they're not really else or other. There's no one who's really left out, right? And it's you know, we can intellectually conjure up this understanding, but if you familiarize yourself with that understanding and integrate it in the way that you act in the world, then responding helpfully to other people isn't work or sacrifice, right? It's just a natural reflex. Yeah, that's the idea. It's not, there's no sense of compassion for another. It's just, yeah, caring for beings who are suffering, ourselves or others. Yeah. Little Jesus in there too. The right hand doesn't congratulate the left hand to giving to the poor. You don't have to pat yourself on the back, right? You just like, no, it's like natural responsiveness. It reminds me of the Zen koan, what is the constant activity of all the Buddhas? What is the constant activity of all the Buddhas? That's kind of potentially stymieing koan. And yeah, and the Zen master said, an appropriate response. That was the answer. Like, yeah, no matter what the situation, yeah, the perfect helper of all beings makes the appropriate response for that situation. Yeah.
Professor
Yes.
Mintuvo has a question.
Okay.
Oh, is it a right good time for a question? You know, if it's not, you know, we can have I can have a question later.
Okay, man, you can ask a question.
Oh, I have a question. So, you know, I actually talk a little bit about this, and I was thinking that, you know, if we go by dependent origination and cause and condition, you know, when I think about it, I was thinking that, you know, the person Trump in his past life, he must have accumulated a lot of good merit, you know? He's like a very old man, but he's still like really strong, and he kind of dodged a bullet, and he managed to accumulate, you know, power and wealth. So in his past life, you know, he must have accumulated a lot of good merit according to the Buddhist worldview. And yet, in this life, somehow he's quite not going in you know, in what we call the right direction, you know, the right direction. So it kind of reminds me of that story in the Buddhist scripture where there was this guy who was like this serial killer, and he was, you know, in his past life he was a good guy, but somehow in this life he was a serial killer. He killed like 1,000 people, and then somehow he met,
Angulimala is his name.
yeah, and then somehow he met Buddha, and then somehow he became arhat. So maybe there is a possibility that, you know, if Trump meet the Dalai Lama and then he become a really good person somehow, you know, that's just like some sort of like
Oh yeah,
wish
I got
wishing
your point. Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, to be born as a human being, right, means that the basic karma that projected this life was a virtuous one. And also to be born in a family with many resources and so forth, that's also associated with generosity in past lifetimes, right? But sometimes the effects of, you know, being patient and restraining acts of harm and being generous in the past lifetime, in addition to generating, you know, payoffs and resources and a good body in future lifetimes, they also have a different kind of karma effect, which is, you know, creating dispositions for engaging in those same kinds of actions again, right? But they don't guarantee anything, right? There's a lot of other forces that are operating, and many times, as we know, people, yeah, don't make the most of the opportunities that they have. But yeah, Angulimala is a interesting parallel, because as you point out, like he was had to have virtue to be born as a human being, but then he was misled by a cult, let's say, into thinking that he could attain immortality by killing a large number of people and making a necklace out of their fingers. And you know, when he met the Buddha and saw the power of the Buddha, then he stopped. That's the way the story goes. He stopped. And then he did ultimately, according to the story, then become an arhat. So that's a hopeful story. Yeah. Okay, let's see if I can get back. Yeah. So I was just on this last point that Joan Halifax was asked, what's the shadow side of the bodhisattva? And she said, helping other beings. So, you know, the idea, the word is other, right? Thinking consciously, oh, those other ones, they need they need my help, right? And I'll extend it to them. And so that kind of like attachment to a dualistic differentiation and representing oneself as the savior of these other beings, rather than seeing your non-duality with them. Yeah, it's really important. Okay, so that was the end of my review. Okay, now we're going to go into the question of what does emptiness really mean for Tsongkhapa? And after we lay that out, then we'll explore how does that relate to ethics and compassion according to Tsongkhapa and Shantideva. Okay, so if things are empty of intrinsic existence, how do they exist? In Tsongkhapa's system, following Chandrakiri, so therefore the Prasangika Madhyamaka system, things are said to be merely imputed or merely designated. I guess there's also been the terminology merely labeled in FPMT. It's the same thing, just a different translation. Because they're empty of having any intrinsic nature or own beings, svabhava in Sanskrit, on their own side. And so they're merely designated or merely imputed from a certain point of view or by thought. And that's pretty hard to understand, because at the same time, Tsongkhapa's system says there are external objects. There are objects that are not just in your mind. There are objects that are of a different, entity from your consciousness. But somehow these objects' only mode of existing is as imputations by thought. So if you don't find that to be stymieing and baffling, right, I'm impressed, because I've found that many different teachers in many different books, have sort of struggled to give clear explanations of this. And I worked for a long time on trying to figure out how to make sense out of it. And because I think I got somewhere with that, based mostly on taking a very, very close reading of things that the Dalai Lama said, but also because of things that Geshe Pelden taught me, who's at Lhasa Ling in India, is still teaching now. I think I figured something out, and I think that's what I wanted to share. So things don't exist by way of some inherent quality or capacity. Their existence is relative to or dependent on a designating mind. And this, Tsongkhapa makes it clear that there's lots of different meanings of dependent arising, like the dependent arising of cyclic existence that Min was just referring to. And also, there's dependent arising. There's all kinds of cause and effect dependent arising. And then there's also dependent arising in terms of any thing that takes up space or time, anything that, an extent of time or any object in space is designated in dependence upon some kind of collection of parts, right? It doesn't exist in and of itself apart from its parts. right? So those are ways that Nagarjuna and many other people in the Buddhist tradition, going back to the Buddha, talk about dependent arising. But there's the subtle meaning of dependent arising for Tsongkhapa is that things exist as mere imputations by thought. That is, for him, the most important thing is not the important thing is to realize that the relationship between a perspective or a consciousness and the object is an interdependent arising, right? There he is. So, yeah. The things I'm going to say from Tsongkhapa are based on the great treatise, The Stage of the Path to Awakening, Lamrim Chemo. So I'm actually going to give a quote, right, from Lamrim Chemo. He said, Tsongkhapa says, there is, with regard to objects, a conception that things have some ontological status, some way of existing in and of themselves, without their being posited through the force of an awareness. And the object of that conception is what we call self or intrinsic nature. The self or intrinsic nature is this idea that things have some way of being in and of themselves. He doesn't say in and of themselves without depending on causes and conditions. He doesn't say in and of themselves without depending on parts. He says in and of themselves without being posited through the force of an awareness. To exist intrinsically or autonomously, meaning to be able to exist without being posited through the force of an awareness, means that something has its own unique manner of being. And he's saying, yeah, I'm speaking hypothetically because that's really not possible. Ignorance or delusion is that consciousness, which instead of recognizing, right, that things do not have, that's the only way things exist. Instead, it apprehends each thing that it apprehends as having a way to exist, such that it can be known in and of itself by way of its own character, without being posited through the force of a conventional awareness. This is what Tsongkhapa says, and this is in the part of Lamrim Chemo where he's defining what emptiness is and what the subtlest object of negation is and what we have to realize in order to be liberated. So what this means is there are conventionally existent objects. There are conventionally existent external objects that are not one entity with our consciousness. They vividly appear, these objects, as though they just exist on their own without needing us, without needing to be imputed from a certain point of view. But in fact, they exist only in dependence on imputation or designation, right? And therefore, they don't have any distinctive character within their own nature. Any distinctive character that they might have is only relative to the point of view of a particular kind of observer, right? So that means, I hope you're following. So that means that conventionally, an object, like for me, is this table that's sitting here underneath the laptop. Conventionally, an object can be X, such as a table from one point of view, and Y from another point of view, and Z from a third point of view, even when X, Y, and Z are all contradictory, right? How can that be true? It's true because things exist only relative to the point of view, and there's different beings such as ants and spiders. It might be, I think there probably are some spiders here in the room somewhere. And, relative to their point of view, which is completely legitimately, wholesomely based on their sense faculties derived from their karma. There is no such thing as a table. It doesn't make any sense. It's not part of their world, right? So there's something that's here, and it's appropriate for it to be designated table from my point of view. And it's also apprehensible to other beings like, my dogs and so forth. But it's not, if a bird flies in here or a spider and so forth, it's not apprehensible to them as a table. If we have hungry ghosts visiting us here in the basement, which you never know, we may, right? Then the table may look like a plane of molten iron or something like that, right? And then from their point of view, it is that, right? Because that's the legitimate point of view that their wholesome, undamaged sense powers show to them on the basis of their karma. And we were just saying, well, it was like, they have some funky kind of karma and they see things wrong. Then that's not the case. Would they see things correctly with their point of view? We see things correctly from our point of view. And the reason we can correctly see them in contradictory ways is because they don't have any objective character of their own, independently on their own side. So things exist, but they have no way, even conventionally, of existing from their own side. So they exist as mental designations or imputations. The example that my teacher, Geshe Pelden Chakpa from Drabung Losaling, gave me in 1985 that began to open my mind up to this is I said, well, he kept talking about designation by thought. And I said, well, of course, the table that's sitting right here, we're talking over, of course, it's made out of atoms. And he said, he thought about it for a minute and he said, no, it isn't. The table, if you say something's made out of atoms, then you're just saying things are materially established objectively on their own side through the composition of certain material particles. And then they're objectively this or that based on how those particles come together. And he's like, yeah, there are atoms there. That's correct from our point of view. And there's a table there that's correct from our point of view. But table is dope daksam. It's merely established as an imputation relative to a certain point of view. It's not established by way of being a collection of atoms on its own side. So when I got to this point, then I started thinking about how, if we don't know what things are, they're things that are apart from our minds, but we can't say what they are in themselves because they aren't anything in and of themselves, then why are things different how can things be different from one another, right? And yeah, it's definitely true that there is a diversity of phenomena in the world, right? So Tsongkhapa says, fundamental ignorance is a mind that regards things and persons as having some way of existing from their own side without depending on designation. So these existing external objects have diverse characteristics that make them either suitable or unsuitable bases of designation for, say, table or something else, right? But they don't have these diverse characteristics from their own side or from their own point of view. They have these diverse characteristics only relative to the point of view of certain kinds of minds that observe them. Yeah. No object has any distinctive character on its own side without depending on its relationship to a conventional perspective for whom that is appropriate, right? You could also be wrong, right? You could be taking some drugs, or you could have damage to your sense faculties, or you could be, in a house of mirrors, or you could, be in an echo chamber, and you could be wrong. You could be deceived. You could be seeing a mirage, right? But taking that our sense faculties are not damaged and they aren't being deceived, right? Then how things conventionally exist from our point of view can have diverse character, right? It's just that they don't objectively have this character or that character on their own. On different kinds of creatures with different realms, different species, their perspectives are different because their karma and their sense faculties are different. There isn't any independent God's eye view, objective way to characterize what kinds of things are out there, right? There are diverse characteristics of external objects, but these can be identified or specified only relative to the perspective of a particular type of being, right? So when we look at the world and we think what kinds of objects are there, or what kinds of objects were there, a short time ago, or what kinds of objects were here in the universe a long time ago, we can correctly designate things in accordance with their conventionally diverse character from our perspective. The problem is that we think that the diverse character we perceive in these objects is intrinsic to the objects themselves, which according to Tsongkhapa, it's not. It's relative to our karma that creates our sense faculties, that cause them to appear in a certain way. So that observers of other species or other realms can quite correctly see something quite different, and as I said, even contradictory, because their healthy, unimpaired sense faculties through karma are set up in a different way. So that's what it means to say that things don't have any nature of their own, but exist only in relationship to a conventional consciousness. Okay. So, not the easiest thing to understand. I explain it a little more slowly in the link in the YouTube video that I linked. Okay, Ranji wants to ask a question.
I just wanted to make a comment as you were describing this. Well, two comments. One was about my mother. She had never seen an iPad. I mean, she's dead now. She died many years ago. And I remember we had given her a Samsung Galaxy and she didn't know what to impute upon this thing. And she put her flowers on top of it. She had this little thing of flowers and she put it on it. And, and she was 84 at the time. And we were like, where's the iPad? And she had no clue what an iPad was.
Right. There's some box that you brought over to my house.
And she put flowers on it.
Yeah.
But she didn't, this concept of imputing some meaning to an external object, I think that's where our language and our stuff or knowledge comes in, because I've seen over and over again, like the second thing I would tell you, years ago in Nepal, some friends and I were taking pictures and people had never seen a camera that went on a stand. And we asked everyone to come behind us, and then the camera went off. It had a timer. And all of them started clapping the camera and were walking around it. And so this concept of imputation, I totally, it resonates with me that we could impute our own meaning onto some object, if you will.
Yeah, I think it starts when we're babies, right? And what you have is examples where adults are encountering new objects that are known in one culture or one family, but not in another. But when we start as babies, we have to learn one thing and how to differentiate things and what we're supposed to impute to what. And of course, it's completely mixed up with language for us. But I would say that, and you can't, it's very difficult to separate that. But I would say that in the system, in the Madhyamaka system, in the Prasangika Madhyamaka system, animals and other living beings who aren't using language, or at least aren't using language internally to designate or conceptualize something, they still correctly regard things in different ways than we do. And I take that as their conventional imputation. Sometimes conventional designation or labeling is talked about as ming sum, meaning a mere name, right? And so for us, it is tangled up with language irretrievably. But there's a layer beneath that. Because if there weren't a layer beneath that, then the cows and the dogs wouldn't also be stuck in cyclic existence, right? Yeah, that's My thought anyway. The tradition says that. Oh, now Amy has a thought.
My question is, I can see what you're saying in terms of look at it with something that has a base, if the base exists. But if the base doesn't exist, then can we speak about that? Could you speak about that?
A base exists. A base exists. And for us, there's a
Well,
correct.
I mean, in terms of, say, the aggregates don't exist in the Heart Sutra. There's
Mhm. They don't, yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. I think. So when you say not exist, you mean they don't exist as in the sense of
inherently,
described as not existing in the Heart Sutra.
yeah.
But that means that they don't ultimately exist. They don't exist in the face of emptiness. They don't exist in the face of a perspective that understands emptiness. If you have a mind that directly knows emptiness, there's no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no mind. There's nothing that appears in the face of a mind that directly knows emptiness, except emptiness itself, right? And this is the point of view from which the Heart Sutra is saying that none of these things exist. It's important to understand that in the, other people may take it a different way, but this is the way almost all of the Heart Sutra is one of the Perfection of Wisdom sutras, and they all speak like this in a paradoxical way in order to express the fact or to convey the fact that things as we're now perceiving them don't actually exist at all. But it doesn't mean that nothing exists. It means things as we're perceiving them right now don't exist at all, right? But there's something when you subtract the exaggerated layers of existential mayonnaise that we slather over things, there are still things that exist and they're different from one another. But what their characteristics are different relative to different beings. This is Tsongkhapa's system. He doesn't want to say that because the Heart Sutra says there's no eye, no ears, no nose, no tongue, no mind, no body, that therefore nothing matters because nothing really exists, right? If you take that's what the Heart Sutra means, then there's no path, there's no liberation.
And it's nihilism, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
But
so yeah, Tsongkhapa's intent upon avoiding a nihilistic conclusion to meditating on emptiness, and he is because he thinks that some people who are reading Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti and the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras in Tibet in the centuries before him were reaching nihilistic conclusions.
I'll leave it there. But I found what your description was for me just now very powerful. And then I came to, well, let's look at the base. So yeah, there.
Yeah, by what you meant by the base was very different from what I thought you meant. I thought you were going in the reifying direction is like, well, there has to be an objective or the real base for which we're imputing things. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's what I was asking. There has to be that's what I was saying. It seemed like the next step from where you were was that.
There are objects and you can call them bases if you want, because they're the bases of imputation, right? And we can correctly, from our point of view, we don't want to look at this and designate it as a cat, right? For our point of view, this is just incorrect. The base is suitable for us to be designated as a cup or a mug or something like that, right? So there are conventionally existent objects, and they do exist as apart from our mind, but they don't have their own diverse character on their own side. It's only relative to our point of view.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. If you can, I know I went a little fast. I mean, this is like, it's very hard to absorb this, and I go in the YouTube video I linked, I go through it a little bit more slowly, but I would also, you can read things like,
I guess what I'm asking is when you look at when you analyze what the base is, then you're doing the ultimate analysis. Is that what happens when you look at the 5 aggregates? You're looking at the ultimate analysis rather than the conventional one. And
Right.
so that what you're describing is conventional analysis. Is that correct?
Right. It's true. That's that's right. The whole question is, things don't have any way of existing objectively, intrinsically, by way of their own nature. How the hell do they exist? That's the whole thing that I'm trying to talk about. Well, how do they exist? They exist as imputations by thought. Well, how can they be, existing apart from our minds if they only exist as imputations by thought? That seems like a very logical question, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to explain. I think imputations by thought means that relative to our point of view, it becomes appropriate to designate, this as a mug. And it's like, it doesn't have any mugginess in here. There's no mugosity or muggicity it out there. Its nature of being appropriate to be designated as a mug is relative to my point of view. My dog never notices that, even though the dog is very healthy. Okay, Bryant.
Oh, thanks. I lowered it again, but I can really just quickly add. I found it really helpful. There's a term in Buddhism called suchness, which I had it explained to me that when you perceive the dependently arisen conventional nature of things and their emptiness together combined, that's what can be termed suchness. And the way I think of it is, and what I think it'll be helpful for Amy is, like the mug, right? Every one of us here has a little sticker that says, "Hello, my name is Mug," that we stick onto that thing that we're looking at. But if we peel off that name sticker, what is that thing? And obviously in different languages, there's different words for mug. And then ultimately, if a dog sees that thing, it wouldn't think mug at all. It would think just maybe a chew toy or something. So what is the thing in itself? It doesn't have any particular way of being other than when we conventionally come to a thing, we need something to put liquid in. And someone in the depths of time came up with the word mug. And then we all just keep using that word mug or glass. But if we rip off all of those word labels that we mentally immediately put on things, you can't, I look at this and I immediately think book. But if I take mentally a step back from that labeling, what is this thing? It's paper, it's got some ink on it, but what's paper? And you just keep going back and back and back. And ultimately, there's nothing at all that you can put any kind of label on. It's
the
all
crucial word there is ultimately, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, there's nothing there that you can put a label on, but
right.
eventually there is a book,
Right.
and you can put a label on it, and that's the way the book exists.
Right.
Right.
So,
because we can read it and we can put the label on when there's a certain kind of collection that appears to us in a certain way. We can appropriately designate a conventionally existent book.
Right. Well, just like in the Heart Sutra, when it says obviously no nose, and everyone thinks, well, of course there's a nose. But the point that it's trying to make is that there's no ultimately existing thing on the middle of your face that you breathe through that is called a nose, but we just have conventionally labeled it a nose for convenience. So I know you're not talking about my ear.
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah,
I don't want to.
There's two levels, right? I think that's maybe Amy's point, is that when you look at things in terms of ultimate analysis, you can't find the bookness of the book or the mugness of the mug or the noseness of the nose. But still, somehow there are books and noses and mugs. How are there those things, even though you can't find them when you look for them, which seems very strange? Well, they have to be conventionally designated, and they have to be designated into in relationship to appropriate bases. And how are those bases appropriate? They're appropriate only relative to the point of view of particular minds, particular beings, particular kinds of consciousness,
Okay.
because they don't have a natural appropriateness to be this or that thing on their own side, right? They have nothing like that. Okay.
Guy, I just want to make a tiny quick comment because this has confounded me. And I've also been reading the Dalai Lama books about going backward in time. How this all relates to quantum physics with particles and, quarks and stuff like that. Because you just made the comment about the table and the atom. And I totally didn't get it because I was always told that when you break things down, you could keep going smaller and smaller till they're space particles. And in the Dalai Lama's book, or one of his books, he talks about space particles. And now we can talk about quarks and prions and blah, blah, blah. And I totally understand that we're imputing mugginess on a mug, bookness on a book. But it's sorry, the Zoom just threw me off. But there is some smaller particle as we get down.
So Ranji, do you think that there's a smallest particle that we can get down to?
Based on what I've read, there appears to be
Yeah.
in relative physics. And the Dalai Lama book, The Universe in a Single Atom, he has a lot of reference to that.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'd just make it clear that I'm going to answer from the point of view of Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist history, and not from the point of view of quantum mechanics, a quantum scientist, which I am not. I just read all those books, including the one you referenced. The important thing to understand about, I think this is really the Dalai Lama's point in the book, is that in Buddhist philosophy, when you break something into parts, every one of those parts can also be broken into parts. So even if you say, and this what happened in the history of Buddhist philosophy, there were some people who said, well, there's really tiny, there's subtle particles that are so atoms that are so tiny they can't be broken any farther. And then the Yogacara people said to them, well, do these particles have an east side and a west side? Do they, or are they like geometric points and they have no extension at all? And then it very quickly becomes the problem is that if they don't have any extension at all, like a geometric point, you can't build anything out of them. But if they have even a tiny bit of extension, then even if you can't physically break it apart, you can understand that it has an east and a west or a top and a bottom or something like that. So that argument was used, in India in the history of Buddhist philosophy to sort of critique the idea that things could be built up and exist by way of a constellation of fundamentally irreducible particles, because some Buddhist philosophies believe that the ultimate truth is the ultimate indivisible, unbreakable particle. And the conventional truths are battleships and people and all this other stuff that we know is reducible because it can be broken down into smaller pieces or smaller moments of time. So there's the same problem with space, which, with the partless particles, happens also with time as well. So the whole idea of space particles and so forth comes up because these particleists is, they're trying to defend an indefensible position, really, by making up things like space particles. And I think what His Holiness is really going for in that book is to say, quantum physics is sort of showing us that deeper and deeper analysis does not lead to a coherent explanation of how things can exist, right? And it hasn't been arrived at, right? So I think that's the reference that, that's in the chat, somebody says.
Catherine had a question.
Yeah, it's a universe in a single atom is the book we're talking about. Catherine.
You're muted, Catherine.
Okay, so you were interrupted just before you were wanting to talk about the title of a book that you recommended, because then the question came. So I just want to send you back to this recommendation that you were thinking about a few minutes.
No, I was trying to, when Amy asked her question, I was trying to, it's so you have to go over this again and again in your mind to start to understand it as a coherent view. I personally think that Jay Tsongkhapa Losang Trungpa was absolutely brilliant thinker and a great philosopher of the world. And he figured out what Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna was saying, and he explained it in a way that's better than people have explained it before or since. I personally believe that. And people have to read Tsongkhapa very, very carefully to understand what he's doing, right? So there's various books you can read. I would suggest a good place to start is How to See Yourself as You Really Are by the Dalai Lama. And, it's a good book generally, but if you focus on the part where he talks about emptiness, he even talks in that book about his own personal experience of emptiness. And he talks about this idea of what could it mean that things are mere imputation by thought. He talks about it, and it's also discussed in my book, Introduction to Emptiness. There are some harder texts as well, like by the cowherds.
Yes, is that the one you're talking about?
You have moon shadows or moon paths? Moon shadows.
Moon shadows. I have both, but
Yeah,
it's hard. I mean, let's put it
yeah. Those are hard. I mean, right. Well, in moon paths, I think well, in those books, my chapters in those books, I try to articulate this view to some extent, maybe not in exact words that I'm using now, but this idea that things exist as mere imputations by thought, and that is how they conventionally exist. And that's what Jay Rinpoche is saying. And delusion is not thinking that things are imputations by thought. It's are taking them as being more than that. We don't go. So when Jeffrey used to teach about this, right, when he was alive, he would say, when you look around the room and you see, oh, there's a picture, there's a wall, there's a staircase, like everything you see, you can stop and think, okay, what's the basis of imputation and what am I imputing to it? And he's like, get used to thinking that these things are not objectively existent as pictures and walls as staircases, but they're appropriately being designated relative to a certain appearance of, in this case, shapes and colors in our visual field. But the same can be, applied to the other senses as well. And that way you get, habituated to the idea of thinking it's just not that there's a table naturally objectively out there with its own table quality. It's just, there is a table there, but it's not objectively existing by way of its own quality. There's something there that's appropriate and convenient and useful for humans to identify and recognize and name as a table, right? Yeah.
Let me add, I think in Ranji's comment, the goal is not to find the smallest particle. You're still in the parts argument. The goal is to see how your mind imputes the concept particle on a phenomenon that's not truly existent as a particle, whether it's a space particle or any other kind of particle. You know, even at the smallest level, if you're still mentally imputing a concept onto some kind of conventional phenomenon, then you're imputing intrinsic existence. Oh, a space particle, right?
Okay, let me just qualify what you're saying. What I'm trying to say is that all the time, conventional existence is a matter of our correctly imputing this to that. Okay. And the problem, delusion, that Tsongkhapa is saying is not that we're imputing things. It's that along with this imputation, there's a superimposition of an exaggerated kind of existence such that these things could exist without being imputed.
Right.
I think I see Ranji getting it. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let me see. Okay, I have a little bit more time. So, I mean, I don't know, somebody with an iPhone who's labeled as iPhone still has their hand up.
Oh, that's me. I'm calling from the car.
Oh.
Yeah, but I'm no longer in a car, so don't worry. I'm not, in some violation of traffic rules.
Oh,
Yeah. So I think one of the questions I have is that going back to our original idea of having this whole series of discussion is whether Buddhism is some sort of escapist philosophy, religion, and I thought, and I think the nature of human life is that we are all escapists to some degree. Like you have a hard day, you go out drinking, you're escaping by the way of alcohol or substances, or you go watch a movie, you're escaping by the way of fiction and so on and so forth. So in some sense, I think we are all escaping to some degree, and maybe escaping by the Buddhist way is slightly more neutral or positive way, I think. And the other thing that when I think somebody mentioned the Hearst Sutra, and I think in the Hearst Sutra, at least my understanding is that the sutra make it very clear that in the wisdom realizing emptiness, there's no suffering, right? There's no suffering in the wisdom realizing emptiness. There's no fear, and far beyond that, we achieve nirvana. And then also in the Vimalakkhati Sutra, it is said that a bodhisattva, without realizing emptiness, is in bondage, in suffering. And a bodhisattva needs to realize emptiness in order to function correctly as a bodhisattva. And so, okay.
So I would just point out that if there's no suffering in emptiness, there's also no realization in emptiness as well. And the Heart Sutra says that actually as well. If there's no suffering, ultimately there's no first, second, third, or fourth noble truth. And that's all contained in Nagarjuna. When the 24th chapter of the Mula Madhyamaka Karakas, he has an interlocutor say, look, you're saying all this stuff is empty. Buddha's empty, time is empty, causation's empty, everything's empty. You've just destroyed the three jewels. You've destroyed the four noble truths. None of this stuff can exist because in the face of emptiness, it's not there. And Nagarjuna turns around and say, no, that's the only reason that these things can work. If they had some intrinsic nature of their own, they'd be frozen and fixed and unable to function. Things can function and work, right? The Dharma can work because, it's pointing at the flowingness of things, the emptiness of having things some sort of locked in, fixed character, right? Yeah.
Which is why there's always hope.
Exactly. Right. Which is what you were saying actually last time, right? Okay. So I don't know how far I'm going to get, but I think it was Catherine last time asked me to talk about emptiness in relationship to ethics. So I want to make at least 2 points related to that. First of all, does emptiness cancel out, if everything's empty, does this cancel out ethical distinctions? But, we've transcended dualistic distinctions between up and down and, good and bad. Maybe then ethics is for dummies, right? It's just for people who are unenlightened, but when people are really enlightened, then they see beyond these dualistic distinctions, and therefore there's, yeah, ethics is there's people who take Chandrakirti, you know, and the Prasangika view as being saying all these teachings about ethics are concessions to fearful beings who, right? But when you really face up to emptiness of things, you transcend all dualistic distinctions, which would imply transcending the distinction between being a serial killer and not being a serial killer, right? For example. And the fact is that there are many types of Buddhism that do seem to say that, and take the Mahayana Sutras and take the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras as implying that. And Tsongkhapa, you know, made the mature Tsongkhapa, you know, say, starting with Lamrim Chemo, from the, you know, from 1402 to 1419, right, or the last part of his life, his whole project was to try to show that this is completely wrong, and that emptiness does not eradicate conventional distinctions, and therefore ethics is to be upheld. It's not harmed in any way by emptiness, okay? And so then there's a separate additional question. If emptiness, you know, doesn't harm ethics, is a separate question of whether does it actually support or lead to or imply some sort of altruistic care for other beings. It's a different question. And I just wanted to look at a few arguments that Shantideva makes, in which he makes several different arguments, and one of them I think is really good, that linking wisdom to bodhisattva motivation. So first, though, on the first point, yeah, any non-dual realization, direct experience of emptiness, it doesn't see any suffering beings. It doesn't see any distinction between virtue and non-virtue, right? It's true, but you know, only emptiness appears to that mind, and there's no one thinking, "Oh, I'm realizing emptiness," right? Because you are not appearing. Only emptiness is appearing. But after you rise from meditation on emptiness, reflecting on that, you know that you've had a direct experience that all things lack some sort of objective or inherent reality that they appear to have, and you've been kind of going along with that appearance, taking it as though it were legitimate, and now you see or know directly that it's fundamentally incorrect. And this false appearance of things as though they exist from their own side, it's still coming at you, but you don't believe it at all anymore because you know directly that it's false. However, this does not at all negate the fact that things exist and they function. They exist and function as their mere imputations by thought. What it negates is the false way in which we've superimposed on them. Don't want to use the word impute to mean two different things. We superimpose upon them a mode of existence, a way of existing without being imputed by thought, right? And that's what's taken away. And so, as I just mentioned in the 24th chapter of the Treatise on the Middle Way, Nagarjuna says, no, you people who think that because we talk about emptiness, we've erased the three jewels in the Four Noble Truths, you have it exactly backwards. It's only emptiness that allows things to work, right? And the world to flow and be interactive. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about that today. But, you know, yeah, read, you can read my book, Introduction to Emptiness. I spend a lot more on that. I call it ultimate and conventional radio. There's a channel we can turn into where we hear all emptiness all the time, but it doesn't cancel out All Things Considered, which is playing on the other channel. Okay, so then this is the other point. Is there any way we can use the fact that things are empty to support or not only not cancel out, but actually push forward the idea that we should be taking care of other beings? Or are these two things, wisdom and bodhicitta, just like completely independent, right? So Shantideva is one of the main relevant thinkers on this point. Of course, his text, The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. Yeah. Can emptiness show that the Bodhisattva's universal loving care is in fact rational, right? So a few arguments derive from the 9th chapter of that text. One is, and this, he spends a good bit of time on, when you see people like harming, right, you realize that they're under the control of irrational emotional reactions that are overpowering their ability to respond appropriately and causing them to engage in actions that are harmful to themselves and others. So that this idea that, and this is what Thich Nhat Hanh wrote this essay a long time ago called, Who Are the True Enemies of Mankind? And it was like, the true enemies of mankind are never other living beings. It's greed and hatred and delusion in the continuum of other beings and ourselves. Those are the true enemies. So this is what Shantideva is in effect saying, when people harm us or are angry toward us, right? We should understand that the delusion of some kind of inherent existence is the base from which greed and hatred and anger are growing and flourishing, and in effect taking over and controlling the other people and causing them to do harm. So the most appropriate response to other people is to aspire to develop the ability to liberate them from reactivity and confusion, and certainly not to take them as objects suitable for us to harm, in which case we would also be harming ourselves. So Tsongkhapa comments on this argument, and he says, Shantideva gives many reasonings, many ideas for dealing with anger towards other beings. And he says, it's easy to be certain of this one, that it's a powerful remedy for anger. So meditate repeatedly on this. That's in a great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment. The second argument is that pride and attraction operate when we ignorantly ignore or fail to recognize the insubstantial nature, the impermanence and disintegration and gradual crumbling of our own and others' bodies. And ordinary people feel intensely protective of what they take to be their own personal bodies. And this attitude can lead to morally questionable behavior. So if we understand what the body is, then we can transform our emotional relationship to it and see it as, like a mechanical construction, right, of interconnected bones and muscles and other parts, right, and not superimpose upon it some intrinsic character of attractiveness and so forth. And to take it as not having any intrinsic value of itself, but as being useful, instrumentally useful to support our practice and to help other sentient beings, and therefore to take care of our bodies on that basis alone. Okay, so I mentioned those two, and there are some others, but the most important one is this one, that suffering is suffering, no matter who is suffering, basically. And I'm quoting Shantideva a few verses now. He's talking to himself, right? That's how the text is written. So I should dispel the suffering of others because it is suffering, just like my own suffering. I should help others because of their nature as beings, just like my own being. When happiness is dear to me and others equally, what's so special about me that I strive for happiness only for myself? I use this argument when I'm teaching Buddhism class. I say, look at the film projector up on the ceiling, and it's looking down on us, and it doesn't see any particular reason to, from that point of view, to prefer the happiness of one of us over the other. And that seems like a more rational view than the one that any of us down here have, where we always are prioritizing only our own happiness. Fear and suffering are disliked by me and others equally. So what's so special about me that I act only to protect myself and not the other? If I give them no protection because their suffering doesn't afflict me, in other words, I know they're suffering, but when they suffer, it doesn't hurt me. So I don't have to do anything for them. But what about the fact that, mature people, adults, right, will prudentially take actions to protect themselves against suffering that they're not experiencing, but might experience in the future, right? Why do I protect my body against future suffering when I'm not feeling any of that suffering? And he's saying, in other words, he's saying, just like there's, a future version of you that isn't you right now, right? That might feel some suffering, but you're not feeling it right now, right? You think that's very important, right? But you don't, also there's this other suffering that's around you right now. You should not think of it as different. That's actually very similar to an argument that's made by a Western philosopher who thinks that the fact that we can be prudent and think about now as just one time among many times and take into consideration what things will be like or might be like in the future and act on that basis. That in the same way, if we consider now in our mental stream as one time among times, each of which will have its own reality, we can likewise consider ourselves as one being among beings, right? And by, what do you say, analogy from the way we act with prudence, also act with altruism. That book that argues that is called The Possibility of Altruism. It's by a Western philosopher called Nagel, N-A-G-E-L. So if you think it's just up to the person who has pain to guard against it, then, it's just look to that one. Then what about a pain in the foot? It's not a pain in the hand, so why is it protected? Why does one take care of? It's like if I have an itch on my left arm, my right arm doesn't think about, like, what's in it for me to go over and scratch right there? Yeah. And so, yeah, without exception, no sufferings belong to anyone in particular. They must be warded off simply because they're suffering. So this is the argument. Either you think that suffering is a problem or you don't. If you think suffering is a problem, then you can say, yeah, my instincts, my habituation is to only care about suffering that I'm experiencing, right? But you can't rationally defend that because all these other beings are equally suffering, right? That's what he's doing. He's using reason to challenge our self-centeredness. And it's a reason that deconstructs the essential duality that we sense between ourselves and other beings, treating other beings as other, right? Not relevant to my continuum. And that's probably this is an argument that's been taken very seriously by Western philosophers, for example, in those cowherd books that Catherine was holding up. And I don't argue about this in those books, but some of my philosopher friends go back and forth. And some people, like Jay Garfield, for example, totally accepts this argument and defends it and thinks it's very powerful. And actually, I've heard him use it with his students. But then there's some other Western philosophers who are engaging seriously with Buddhism, but they don't like this argument because they have kind of a dogma, you could say, or a doctrine that you can never derive an ethical principle from, a statement about how things exist. And ethics has to be separate from questions of how things exist. But yeah, Shanti Dev is trying to make a case that that's not necessarily true. When you see how interconnected we are with other beings, then it's just natural to react with care toward them. Yeah. And this is from the encyclopedia, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is freely available online and is one of the best reference texts for philosophy, and which fortunately now takes Buddhist philosophy seriously as philosophy. And in the article on Shantideva, there's one passage where it says, many Buddhist texts, in fact, assert that if we experientially directly realize that there's no substantial self, this realization will cause us to become more altruistic. But Shantideva here argues, maybe even for the first time, that even an intellectual understanding of the absence of any, intrinsically existent self gives us a reason to affirm altruism and say that, altruism, whether we're altruistic or not, we can understand that to be altruistic is supremely rational, and our reflexive egoism is actually, instinctually driven and not rationally tenable. Yeah, that's what the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says. So this is the strongest philosophical argument that, spells out exactly how the non-dualistic insight of emptiness can support rather than undermine loving compassion. And I have this movie that many people don't really think is a very good movie. The difference of opinion is fair. It was a made-for-TV movie in 2005 for BBC called The Girl in the Cafe. And it's about a British diplomat who's going to a conference on what can we as world leaders do to eliminate extreme poverty, which is defined as poverty that is actually killing people, right? But this guy gets infatuated with this random young woman that he happens to meet in a crowded cafe. And he decides to take her along with him to this conference in Iceland, which is very unconventional situation. And it turns out that she has an agenda in doing this, is she wants to go to this conference. And ultimately, it's embarrassing to him when it comes out that she has a criminal record. And then he confronts her and he said, well, what is your crime? And she said, I was sentenced to prison for hurting a man. And he says, well, why did you do that? And she said, because he hurt a child. And he said, was it your child? And she said, does it matter whose child? And it's like, I just had this experience when she said, does it matter whose child? And it's like, oh, that's exactly the point that Shantideva is making, right? Not that he's endorsing revenge or anything, right? Not at all, right? But it doesn't matter whose child. Yeah, it does to us. And it ordinarily, that's our experience of the world. Bodhisattva realization goes beyond how we ordinarily are, for sure. Yeah. Okay, so I have yet another fourth chunk here, but I'm just going to make it available to those of you who are attending by sending the PowerPoint slides to Sunny, as it happens, instead of Veronica, and she can share them with you. Because that's enough. The next topic isn't really easy either. I can just summarize it in saying that every other sect of Tibetan Buddhism attacks and criticizes and sometimes even mocks the Gelugpa tradition of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Tsongkhapa, because we claim that there is such thing as reliable conventional knowledge. And they say that this is utterly contradictory and incompatible with the profound emptiness of Prasangika Madhyamaka. And you're just showing how little you understand. And that this idea of conventional reliable knowledge comes from Dharmakirti. And Dharmakirti was not an advocate of Madhyamaka or Prasangika in any way. And so his system is based on a realistic idea that there is a nature in things, and we can have a perception that corresponds to or matches up with that nature. And since Prasangika rejects that, we can't have conventional reliable knowledge. That's what they say. And Tsongkhapa insists that we can have conventional reliable knowledge. But how does he pull it off, to just say, yeah, things are empty of any intrinsic existence on their own side, but somehow we can have conventional reliable knowledge of them. And it turns out, if you really study this closely, following Chandrakirti very closely, Tsongkhapa discerns that the Prasangika way of understanding reliable knowledge is not by way of some certainty that you're right, because there's a match between your perception and some nature in the object, because you can't, that's impossible, right? But rather, when you have some understanding and you act on the basis of that understanding, and the actions are effective and they're not impeached or discredited or superseded or shown to be wrong by other kinds of insight, right? Then we can treat that as conventional valid knowledge until perhaps at some future time, some further analysis or amplification of our sense powers with microscopes or telescopes, or, you know, various other means, or perhaps we develop clairvoyant powers or whatever, some amplification of our mental or sense faculties allows us to understand or analyze more deeply and have a view of things and a way of acting that supersedes and discredits what we took to be knowledge in the past. In other words, conventional reliable knowledge in Prasangika doesn't mean absolute certainty. It means good enough for going on with. It means we have a working hypothesis. If we act on the basis of this hypothesis, things work out. I have a friend who is a quantum scientist, and he doesn't care what it means. He just says, when I use the formulas, they work. That's how he does. That's what it means to be true for him. Yeah. Right. That's the quick and dirty on that. Okay, let's, I'll stop and see if there are any more questions, which I can see that Bryant wants to make a comment. Go ahead, Bryant.
You kind of already gave voice to what I was going to say, but just to reiterate, so to my understanding of what you're saying about this conventional reliable knowledge, seems to me that the Prasangika way of arriving at that is really the only useful way that can prevent suffering, because if you think that you're certain about something, but only contingently and provisionally, not inherently, that something isn't, you know, intrinsically true, that then you're always open to being corrected. And in science, I believe I don't know if I'm misapplying this concept. There's this thing called the null hypothesis, which means in any hypothesis I offer about reality, there's always the possibility I'm wrong, you know. Right. And so if you have that kind of loose, you know, that kind of,
it's pragmatism. It's a pragmatic approach rather than we have to have absolute certainty. There's a match between what we're perceiving and something out there on the object side. Therefore, yeah, there can always be improvement in the way we think about things. And I absolutely agree. You'll see. I mean, I quote Karl Popper, who's the famous philosopher of science, and he's saying science takes an evolutionary approach where we offer hypotheses and then we run experiments and we try to refine or improve the model we have of how things work. And if we have an improved model of how things work, then we can interact with people in a better basis. And for me, I'm not super interested in philosophy of science. This is all directly how we take care of people. So when you go to goes back to the 3 tenets I talked about before. When you go to take care of someone who's suffering, the first thing is to know that you do not know for certain what to do for them that will be helpful, because you're not clairvoyant, you're not a Buddha. You have to know that you don't know, that you're uncertain. But you do have some information. If you listen, if you pay attention, if you open your heart, if you're there with the person, right? Then you will, gain information that will give rise to intuitions, or we could say hypotheses about what might be helpful for this person. Maybe it would be helpful for me to go away. maybe it would be helpful for me to say a prayer to whatever God they believe in. I mean, whatever you don't know before you get there. And, but if you're present, then you can gain information. And then if you try something and it doesn't seem to be working, then, you can improve your understanding and develop a better practice. And if you think about it, that's the way doctors work in clinics, right? They never have absolute certainty, but they get information and then they try things to try to help people. And if it doesn't work or it's counterproductive, then try something else.
Right.
The mode of operation of Dr. Buddha.
Right. Nice.
Okay, I will stop talking. But thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you for your
Thank
teaching.
you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's been good. I've enjoyed this. It's been very helpful to me. I think it's a very timely topic, obviously, and I needed to have the opportunity to start digging into it. Do you guys know who Geshe Sangye Sandrup is? Probably not.
Sangha group, George Dreyfus,
Yeah,
Yes.
George?
from kindergarten in La Chaux-de-Fonds.
Oh, no, really? You knew him from kindergarten?
Yes, we were together in kindergarten and then high school, and my connection to Buddhism came from there. And then Tom Tillerman.
Oh, you knew Tom too. Okay.
So Tom is also a good friend and landed in La Chaux-de-Fonds, where George and I come from, and lived in my father's apartment when they had no place to stay after he came back from Japan.
How interesting. Well, thanks for telling me that.
So
Yeah.
But go back to Sangye Sangha.
Well, I just wanted to say George, who is, Geshe Sangye Sandrup, he's an example of a person who's open about the fact that he's just really crushed by the turn of events in the United States of America. And, I feel like this is all around, and I want to try to offer some small amount of light or inspiration that I can, if I can. And I think that Rebecca Solnit's book, Hope in the Darkness, is a good resource. And I know that Roshi Joan Halifax has really bonded with Rebecca Solnit over this book for exactly the same reason. I mean, we definitely need to have something, some kind of inspiration in this time.
Well, it's one inspiration I take is the action component of emptiness, which is knowing that things are never permanently fixed. And so if we take action, somehow call a congressman or do something, we have the ability to affect things, even if minutely. We can always create the conditions of the future through our speech, our actions of body, speech, and mind.
Yeah, I read something recently say that if you call a congressman's office, there's somebody who answers the phone and they take a note about what issue, and ultimately the Congress people all get a report about how many people called about what issues. That's data. That it doesn't go into nothingness. It does, in a quantitative way, at least, make its way into a congressperson's mind.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, everybody. My best wishes for the months and years ahead. Yeah. Hope all.
We so need this to keep us sane.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll keep on keeping on. Let's do the best we can.
There's always hope.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Guy.
Thank you, Professor Newman.
Thank
Please
you.
come back, teach again.
Yeah.
Continue.